And let's take the elevator music out and we can start. Welcome to another episode of Industry Meets Science. This is a live talk series in which we discuss innovations from Germany, as you just saw, to meet global challenges as they are presented at this very moment at the World Expo in Dubai. My name is Niko Palosuo, and now you can see me more clearly. And I'll be hosting these talks from my virtual studio, which has a super low carbon footprint, let me assure you. Together with Forschungszentrum Jülich, we have been running these shows already a couple of times. Both organizations are presenting exhibits at the German Pavilion, so if you are in Dubai, be sure to check them out. The expo is open until the end of March. Today, we talk about future cities. We talk about architecture and we talk about mobility. And we'll put a special emphasis on the role of high-rise buildings because they appear to be popping up like mushrooms in the rain, which is a Finnish saying, but maybe also a Spanish and English saying. We talk about the influence of design and urban planning, and we'll discuss the challenges of mobility solutions. After all, cities need to be great places to work and live. And as people and activities move more and more into cities, the only way is up. Or is it? I guess we'll soon find out. Which brings me to today's panelists. And we couldn't be more honored to have this group with us today. Let me put them up on screen. Here we are. Let's start on location in Dubai, where we have Benjamin Piper, Associate Partner and Design Principal from Killa Design. Welcome, Ben.
Thank you very much, Nico. Fantastic introduction.
Killa is known for a lot of things, among others, the boldly shaped Museum of the Future in Dubai, which, you know, it has a hole in the middle. And I also like the 3D printed offices in the same city. Great to have you with us, Ben.
Thank you very much. Great to be part of the show.
Next up is VP Business Development Javier Sesma from TKE, which stands for TK Elevators, formerly known as ThyssenKrupp Elevators, now an independent brand and very much the innovator it has always been. Welcome, Javier.
Hi, thank you very much, and thanks for the opportunity for being with you today.
So TKE is a fellow German exhibitor at the World Expo, featuring many of their innovations there. And now, Javier, Ben was from Dubai, but you're joining us from somewhere in north of Spain.
North of Spain, yes, Asturias, north of Spain.
Fantastic. And last but definitely not least, Antony Wood, President on the Council of Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat, an organization which has been advancing sustainable vertical urbanism since 1969, straight from the Windy City. Antony, fantastic to have you with us.
It's fantastic to be here, but I would much rather be in Dubai, I can tell you. Here in Chicago, it's about minus 15 degrees Celsius outside. So I'd much rather be with you in Dubai right now, but it's a pleasure to be involved.
Before we go into the discussion, let me remind our amazing audience that you can ask questions and make your comments in the chat, as always. You know, our guests are true experts in their fields with amazing experience. You know, just Google these guys. So use your chance and get your fingers warmed up. And to be truly interactive, let's open up also a Slido poll, which I'll be showing with you shortly. So here is the Slido poll. I'm asking you guys you go to Slido, slido.com or slido.do, type in #expo and give us your thoughts. Which city is your role model for the future? And let's see if we can tickle some comments from our experts as we go along. So I want to start with a fresh commentary on the situation. which we have today, and which is, I think, pretty obvious. It's the pandemic and its effect on cities and also on urban areas. I mean, we can all see that it has had an impact on use of office space. I mean, we are all at home at this place. Omicron is all over the place. So how has the pandemic affected the move into higher buildings? And Antony, let's start with you. As Chicago, I read this. Chicago is home to the world's first modern skyscraper. I wonder if it still exists.
It does not exist, unfortunately. It only lasted about 30, 40 years before they knocked it down to build something taller, which of course is an issue with a lot of buildings around the world. But no, I mean, to go back to your question about how has the pandemic hit cities, it's hit societies in so many ways, which will become more and more apparent in the years ahead. But, I think we've got to set the context here. United Nations statistics show that there are 1 million people. This may have been slowed during the pandemic, by the way, but about 1 million people urbanizing on this planet every week for the next 30 years. Okay, so let's get the context. That means 1 million people moving into cities or being born into cities around the world every week. So the next question is, where the hell do those people go? So we as a species on this planet need to build the equivalent of Chicago every month to cope with this expansion. And what we've seen over the last 20, 30 years has been an explosion of tall building construction around the world. I think you have a graph, one of our graphs to show this, Nico. And your viewers might not be able to see the detail here, but basically in the 1990s and prior to the 1990s, the entire world was building on average about 12 projects greater than 200 meters in height. Only 12 projects. And then you can see from the 1990s onwards, and in the last decade, the entire world was building about 112 of these projects. So there's been this explosion of tall buildings, which is driven by many different factors. It's driven by ego. It's driven by cities competing with each other and feeling they need to have a skyline to compete. It's driven by commerce, but it's also driven by this requirement to house 1 million new urban dwellers every week. And so, against that context, the COVID pandemic is going to have a massive impact on life work scenarios, on the city, on mobility. It already is. But it's not going to, some people have called the death of the city, the death of the tall building, as a result to COVID. And I can categorically say that is not going to happen. And I'll conclude this little segment just by saying the last time we concluded the death or announced the death of the tall building was almost 20 years ago to the day in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. That event was so gargantuan that people could never imagine living, working, and recreating in tall buildings after what happened with the collapse of the World Trade Center. Well, I am here to tell you that 84% of tall buildings that exist around the world today, 84% of 200-meter plus tall buildings around the world have been built since 9/11, and that is thousands of buildings. So certainly 9/11 did not result in the death of the tall building, in the death of density, and I don't believe that COVID will either. And final thing, if it does result in the death of density, then we've got an even bigger problem in terms of carbon sustainability and climate change.
Thanks, Antony. I think these are really important comments to make, to put things into perspective. What shocks to the society have happened and what impact they have or have not had on the societies on that time. Maybe, Ben, you can build on this. I mean, you are in Dubai. World Expo is in Dubai. I mean, surely we can see Dubai. I mean, it's a really a sprawling city, but it has also been hit by the pandemic. And maybe the World Expo is also an example of that. What are your thoughts, Ben?
Well, look, my thoughts on Dubai in general is that sometimes visitors to Dubai, maybe coming for the first time, are kind of seeking this idea of an authentic city. and are maybe somehow feeling slightly disappointed. And Dubai, as an example, has a kind of a reputation of somehow being inauthentic. But I take quite a different view, actually. I think that the fact that Dubai has grown so quickly over the past number of years means it is actually a very authentic city in the sense of it is a representation of the way that society and city building is working today. And never before have we had this sort of phenomenon of centrally master planned or more or less instantaneous kind of cities, which is certainly in the last sort of 10, 20 years, to Antony's point, had to deal with these massive urbanization of the world population. So I think it's really interesting because you may take issue with certain of the aesthetic aspects of a place like Dubai, but it is a reflection of what can happen when capital and marketing and different kind of people around the world are connected in a new and unique way. And I think one of the big surprises that I always remember when first coming here, because originally I saw Dubai as a skyline, and I just assumed, having lived in other let's say tall cities in the past, in New York and a short while in Chicago, I just assumed it was more or less the same kind of dynamics that led to that tall skyline. But there's moments that when you're up in some of these tall buildings, especially on Sheikh Zayed Road, which is the main drag or the main strip of the city, you can see empty desert within about half a kilometer. And the forces at play in Dubai are more complex and more layered than simply a sort of manifestation of the land value that you might get in a more traditional kind of city. I think Antony's point about the role of ego and this desire to represent oneself, whether as a nation, as a city, as a brand, as an individual, through this built expression. And this is where the kind of sculptural and psychological aspect of tall buildings really comes into play. Many of the tall buildings that we have here in Dubai, as an example, are not strictly required from a land use perspective, but we find ourselves in a city with plenty of land, actually being the tallest city per capita in the world. And I think that's an interesting relationship between the desire to make a mark and how that's translated into architecture. Interestingly enough, the tall tower is not necessarily the densest way to inhabit a large human population. There's quite a few studies that look at courtyard typologies, which lower rise can actually achieve a much greater density. But these require very, very large land plots, and they're large building projects. And in a way, the land division sets into motion the sort of resulting urban form, you could say. So there's many layers to the whole question.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Thanks, Ben. I think we all look at Dubai with fascination on how it has developed, and in a such stark contrast with the nature, and of course with the global climate goals. We'll be discussing also later a little bit about sustainability, on how to combine these different goals. Javier, you work for a company that is truly global. I mean, you work all around the world, TK Elevators all around the world. What's your kind of point of view on the effect on the pandemic, and maybe on where we are right now with the state of the cities?
I think I mean there is no doubt, and I think Antony has shown that. I mean, we have seen different crises in the past, but if we look at overall picture as of today, maybe the first thing that we need to take into account is that about 2 billion people will additionally live in cities in 2050. So if we look at how does it look like to places like to big cities, so this means that probably another example complementing to what Antony was saying, prior to the pandemic, there was about a city of the size of Manhattan being built every day. So I think there is no doubt that, I mean, let's say urbanization is growing up. This will mean that in 2050, this 70% of urban population has invert the trend of 100 years ago. So 100 years ago, there was about 30% of people in the world living in cities versus 70% in 2050. But even going higher, if we look at the cities maybe like Shanghai, for instance, there is, let's say, a big impact of also big cities. So as of today, about 60% of the gross domestic profit is coming from 600 cities. So there is about 70 cities which are more than 6 million people. And also, I mean, just adding maybe some caveat to what Ben was mentioning. I mean, let's take the example of Dubai. Yes, I mean, it's right. Dubai, all these buildings were not maybe necessary, but as of Dubai, is an example of a city that has 85% of the population is urban. Likely will, and probably Ben can add, but it will be maybe 90%, and has the biggest concentration of super tall buildings. So it almost duplicates the amount that you have in the following cities like Guangzhou and Shenzhen with 21 mega tall buildings. So I mean, from our perspective, there is no doubt there is a trend for high density, and that will require probably a think of how we want to design buildings, how we want to live, work, and entertain on those buildings with different building uses. And I'm sure that that Ben will have a lot of ideas on those elements.
Thanks. And Ben, you are muted right now.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, my apologies. I just think on this point of the pandemic, it is interesting what it's done to the property market in Dubai, which has traditionally had a very, very strong emphasis on the high rise, as you mentioned. But the pandemic in particular has really made people appreciate their personal space like never before. Not only from a sanitary perspective in terms of, nervousness around sharing elevators or public corridors with large populations of tower neighbors, as it were, but also from the personal space in order to expand with the whole working from home or the general kind of lockdown. So there's been a bit of a shift in terms of the aspirations. A lot of tower dwellers are looking to be getting closer to the ground. Now, this might just be a slight, blip in the progress, and then what you're describing really before in terms of urbanization globally, I'm sure, is carrying on at quite a rate. But I do think that's something that's quite interesting that's come out of the whole COVID phenomenon.
So thanks, Ben. Just looking at where we are with the poll right now, our audience thinks Singapore and New London and Old London stand in for their role models of the future. But Ben and Javier, what you just also mentioned, and Antony, the role of the buildings seem to be changing, not only because of Corona, but because of all the other things we are witnessing right now. I can remember actually, when I grew up in Finland, I watched Dynasty and Dallas, of course, like the kids in that area, and they all worked in this glass facade high-rise building. And I wonder if the high-rise of the American 80s is probably a thing of the past from a conceptual level. And if we think about the urban realm going forward, the public environments, the ecosystem that the high-rises really represent, I wonder how they will be evolving in the coming years. And Ben, we continue with you, because I know Killa has been talking a lot about the context of the building. I mean, it's not just the building itself; it's really where it is. So maybe you can elaborate on that.
Well, sure. Look, I think your point about the sort of American 1980s interpretation of modernism and how that kind of spread to many parts of the world, including Dubai, led to this situation of what some people have referred to as an iced tea kind of building. It's the worst case scenario, actually. If you think about the drink iced tea, the first thing you do in iced tea is you boil water. So that's pretty energy intensive. By the way, if you boil water in Dubai, it's already been desalinated, so it's already got a lot of embodied energy. You boil the water up, You make the tea, and then you add the ice to bring the temperature right down. So in terms of embodied energy, it's basically the worst drink you can have, and that's more or less what these glass buildings, of which we have many here in Dubai, are. They're iced tea buildings where they're built to give as much natural daylight as possible, and then they're engineered both in terms of the facade and in terms of the MEP systems to cope with all that heavy load. And now there's some very interesting technology in terms of glazing performance that's developed recently to help bring those energy loads down. But I suppose as a firm here working in the Middle East and as architects, like any architects really, we try to approach the problem of how to design our buildings from first principles. We'll look at the environment, we'll look at the culture, we'll look at the context, and we try to respond in a very bespoke way to the particulars of a given site or project.
Thanks, Ben. Antony, you have been talking a lot about the context of buildings as well. I think you mentioned somewhere in your presentations that you feel that all skyscrapers shouldn't be alike. They definitely shouldn't be alike. So maybe you can comment also the role of buildings. I mean, is the 80s J.R. Ewing building coming back?
Well, let's hope not. Hey, but I'm going to go a stage further than Ben. Perhaps I can in my position, although it surprises a lot of people when I say what I'm about to say. I think that 95% plus of tall buildings in existence today are really not good pieces of design at all. I think, and the reason for that is because most tall buildings, the 95%, are driven by one of two design directions. The first is they're just a commercial box. I'm not even sure they're architecture. That's the J.R. Ewing, the Dallas, the glass tower. It's maximum efficient floor plan, extruded through, you choose 40, 60, 80 stories, and clad in glass. It's just about a commercial return. The second type of building is where the tall building is designed as a piece of sculpture, and sometimes quite, crazy forms. And that might result in kind of a more interesting tall building, but the relationship between the building and the city is just a visual one. It's a relationship that says, hey, I think I'm beautiful, behold me. And that's really not what architecture is about at all. Because by the way, next door there's another, hey, I think I'm beautiful, behold me. And what we get is the city is a zoo. The city is a menagerie of competing icons that self-cancel each other out. Now, here's the irony. Some of these cities where these buildings are located have hundreds, and in some cases, thousands of years of vernacular tradition in architecture, meaning that architecture used to be a response to its place. It had to be. It had to be. We didn't have energy to be able to,
ignore the environment.
So the building had to be a response to its site, environmentally, physically, socially, materially. We couldn't mine materials in Australia, ship them for fabrication in China, and deliver them on site in Germany or whatever. So and that's why when you travel around the world, and this is largely why people travel around the world, every place is different. And the architecture is a big factor in that. If you think about, the Chinese pagoda, the Islamic mosque, the Western cathedral, whatever typology you look at, it evolved differently as a response to place. Well, 1950s modern architecture, that all went out the window, and this rectilinear, air-conditioned, isolated box, isolated from all context, became the predominant model. And still today, unfortunately, a large percentage of buildings are still built to that model, and so to me, we've got to increase density in cities. We've got to go with the vertical realm. The horizontal realm is completely unsustainable in terms of land use and the infrastructure to support such existence. But the tall building itself is only several baby steps, in my view, along the path it needs to tread to truly become sustainable. And really what we're talking about a whole bunch of things. We're talking about green walls. We're talking about public communal space. We're talking about use of roof plane. We're talking about solidity and opacity in buildings and not built out all of glass. We're talking about mass timber. We're talking about vegetation, growing produce in buildings. We're talking about 20, 30 things that only you're seeing some examples up on your screen now. So when I say 95% of tall buildings are not great, fortunately, 5% of them, which is still hundreds and hundreds of buildings, are fantastic. But the ones that are fantastic really break out of this predominant approach. This is a building in Tokyo, that's not just green wall, that's vegetables and fruit, which is eaten inside the office building, the project you're seeing up there. So we've got to break out from these things becoming commercial animals or just iconic sculptural animals and get back to, indigenous architecture. I believe there can be a Chinese tall building, a Middle Eastern tall building, an Australian tall building, an American tall building, and these things are all different.
So I think that's, Antony, really inspiring to listen to you and talk about what a building should be. And how it should reflect the environment and the use and the needs of the people. And I think some of these examples that we saw are really, really out of this world if you indeed compare to some of the, let's say, monoblock design that we see still in many parts of the world. Javier, let me come back to you as somebody who is through your company, you see all kinds of uses for buildings, all kinds of purposes for buildings. You guys deliver technology to really, I can imagine, all kinds of needs. So what are your perspectives on the role of buildings and how do they evolve? What are some of the trends that you're seeing from your point of view?
Well, I mean, I like very much the example of the iced tea. I think, Ben, that is a very good representation of a glass building. So I think, I mean, for somebody that has the challenge to bring people to buildings. So for somebody that, as Antony was saying, to a certain extent, some of these buildings will become vertical cities or vertical silos. Let me take a wider perspective. Let me take the perspective of that building within the city. I think the challenge we don't have as of today is also a little bit of a dichotomy between super and mega tall buildings and the consumption of energy. I mean, as of today, where 30% of the energy consumed worldwide happens in buildings, in elevator being a little bit 10% of that. I mean, we don't have a responsibility. So buildings versus consumption of energy. Also, the way we are going to live in cities. I think Antony was putting a very nice example about buildings. Okay, so from that let's say perspective, also we need to also understand how buildings are going to be used, and also the new trends. I mean, something that we see typically in building traffic. In the past, we used to call it the Starbucks effect, which is everybody goes to the office, goes to their desk, go to the Starbucks, and then to take a coffee and go back. That challenged all the elevator traffic algorithms. Okay, now is e-commerce. Okay, so how do we bring goods to these buildings? And then also at the end of the day, I mean, we are doing buildings to have better places to work, to live, or to entertain. Okay, so people need to come to buildings. So how do we bring sustainable people to this building? What about multimodal seamless mobility? I mean, the most efficient mean of transportation in big cities is obviously public transport. So how do we make sure that those buildings are not just silos and are connected? And then, I mean, considering, let's say, everything that is being built, and I think Antony was mentioning that, how we can reuse or recycle what is out there to make sure we convert those spaces in more livable cities. And maybe the last item is I mean, are we going to build buildings the same way we have done before? And I'm sure Ben can comment on that, but modularity, flexibility for that mixed use, not everything should be high rise, also low rise. So creating those spaces to live and entertain is interesting. Maybe I would just an example. I mean, you mentioned pandemic. I think, Nico, and maybe let me bring an example of our experience with COVID-19 in data. So we took more than 60,000 elevators we had in the US that are connected to the cloud, and just using the power of that data, so we are able to assess the activity in buildings. I think Antony was mentioned about success of a building. Okay, using data, we can monitor, and it's impressive to see how COVID has affected the number of trips in buildings, almost 61%, but how using data, we can even assess the activity in buildings in the North American winter storm, in Thanksgiving, in Christmas, or also sometimes how we can understand how this is going to affect the different building types and different sectors. I mean, let's take healthcare, office, or hospitality, or even residential, or even how we can carve out using data the success of those economies, of those sectors. And maybe we could do that as of today, breaking by state, by country, even by city. So I think there are two probably ways of looking at that, and maybe this is an example of the US. So we can see the effect of pandemic, but we could also think on the effect of good design neighborhoods. So we can carve out using data almost by city, by building type. And it's interesting because at the end of the day, as of today, we design buildings to be successful places to live, and we can, using data, understand whether we have been successful or whether maybe those buildings that were built before what would modernize or renovate for a different purpose, which is, I think, something which is happening because of COVID very much. Reuse of buildings for a different space. And I'm sure, I mean, probably Ben and Antony has a lot of very good examples on that.
Yeah, I mean, look, I just wanted to make the point what you were saying about the kind of the smart data aspect is I often walk around cities or buildings or car parks or spaces in general and think, my gosh, you know, this thing is basically not being used most of the time, and it exists only for that small amount of time where maybe somebody's parked there or somebody's sleeping in that space or somebody's using that bit of office. And I think that there is a great deal of opportunity in terms of how we can use information technology, AI, pattern recognition, social networking to really optimize the use of the existing infrastructure that we have. And you see signs of it in, let's say, the kind of car sharing economy where people are moving away from the idea of car ownership and more towards a sort of micro rental model that's very, very dynamic. I need a car. It needs to be 100 meters distance from me. Okay, let me find it on this app. And you could imagine a similar kind of thing happening for space, so that rather than everybody being so attached to their spaces and therefore the use of the space being so exclusive and quite honestly very inefficient, maybe we will see patterns in society where it's absolutely acceptable to be a respected global architecture practice that doesn't have a physical base, but that just adapts that office space or that working place or even a living space in a very dynamic and optimized way. And this is moving beyond solving the problems that Antony's highlighted through purely built infrastructure, but it's like, how do we use that infrastructure in a more smart way?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, I mean, fully agree, Ben. And I think probably the way we see now spaces for future. And I think COVID, I mean, you mentioned that for living, but I think also for working. I think we see more and more that we are going to design places where we will have to work, to live, and to entertain. And when we are thinking about moving things within building, I mean, the first thing we see is that, I mean, let's say buildings are going to be hyper connected. So it's not going to be just about connecting people, which is the traditional use, particularly in workspaces, but also using artificial intelligence to do remote monitoring, remote operation. I think user experience, I think health and well-being will become not just a premium, just a standard. I think COVID has shown now the big demand for open spaces, windows, terraces in a lot of countries, and also the idea of we will have to, successful buildings are buildings that have also, I mean, from our experience, vertical transportation, successful vertical transportation, but we need to believe that we will not only transport people, but we also transport goods. And I think you mentioned a very important thing, Ben, which is data. I think some of these vertical nodes become also data highways. To try to understand what is happening in the building, how buildings react to the use of the building. And I think that is probably a different discussion on dimensions, on what do we move in buildings, how do we use buildings, maybe.
Thanks, Ben and Javier. I think data indeed, it's crazy to see what is happening based on the data that you are able to collect from these buildings. And actually, we have an audience question already to that point. Let me bring it up. And actually, Ben, I was inspired to hear. I mean, a respectable architecture company can function without a physical locality.
Well, I don't think we're there yet, because it's sort of socially embedded, the idea that, you know, somebody that's an entity that's trustworthy and established, you know, has its headquarters and its space and things. But I think that's shifting, and you see it, for example, in my city here, the serviced office market is really booming as business is a little bit cautious about committing long term with these volatile times, but it's becoming much more nimble, and sort of the idea of being based out of a temporary serviced offices that can expand or contract based on sort of project requirements or staff requirements is becoming basically normalized. So I think we'll see that, you know, reflecting in the way that buildings are designed as patterns of use change.
And I would love to know actually more. This is going out of the topic, but as the metaverse is being built and digital buildings are being built, where people kind of live in a hybrid virtual physical combination, where you're working both inside a virtual building and a physical building, how that looks like. But before we go there, let's take a question from the audience. We have Richard. Thank you, Richard, for posing the question. Let's take it right away, because I think this fits to the topic of building use. So we can I can read it out loud. Highly varied mixed-use towers are becoming more prominent and viable in the future city with so many functions: retail, commercial, office, residential, etc. How will tall building evolve to effectively and safely accommodate so many different uses? It's cutting off the rest of the question, but how do you combine all of these things? I mean, do you just build bigger towers, or kind of what's your take on Richard's question? Who wants to go first?
I can jump in on that, Nico. Okay, can you show my slide number 3, which is about mixed-use towers? I just want to echo what Richard is saying there. You know, we do a study. We do data studies every year, and this is a study that looks at the 100 tallest buildings at the end of each decade. So you can see here that as recently as the year 2000, not a long time ago, 83% of the 100 tallest buildings in the world were all office buildings. You know, that is now 36% and falling. There has been a major shift towards mixed-use buildings, as Richard is saying there, 49%, I think that is. You know, and there's a whole bunch of reasons for that, not least that, you know, owner developers are edging their bets on residential market and office market and retail market, not all being down at the same time. But again, I would argue that is not yet going far enough. And I'd like you, if you can, Nico, just to jump to my slides at the end where I talk about the future city. So let me just put this proposition across to you, because it's linked to mixed use, but it's also linked to what Ben was talking about and Javier in terms of infrastructure. So imagine this scenario. This at the moment is a mid-rise city. Yeah, it's just a conceptual idea. Mid-rise city, and 1 million people live there. And what I want to point out here are the things in color. So this is not a high-rise city, but the things in color represent infrastructure. And when I say infrastructure, I don't just mean physical linear infrastructure like streets and power and water and sewage. I do mean that, but I also mean social infrastructure, meaning park, garden, sidewalk, school, doctor's surgery, shop. This all exists at the ground plane. Okay, so move forward with the slides, please. You'll see, so this existing city of 1 million, over the next 10 years is going to 10 million. So where do those other 9 million people go? So do they go horizontal? No. The city cannot spread horizontally because of the energy, land use and the energy it takes to create and operate the horizontal city. So there's only one direction that those people, those 9 million people, can go, and that is vertical. And there is the vision of a beautiful future city. No, absolutely no, because all those projects there, those white boxes, are office, residential, hotel, or some variation of those three things. That is not the city. What happened to the infrastructure I just talked about? All those other functions. So I believe, and we at the council believe, that the building needs to become almost like a piece of that two-dimensional infrastructure-rich plane flipped vertical with the infrastructure, with the gardens, with the social spaces, with the schools, with the shops, with the surgeries. And the vision of cities of the future is really what we call the sustainable vertical urbanism, because we've put 9 million more people living on the same plot of land. So therefore, we need to recreate all those service functions, all those social functions and the infrastructure up in the sky. So back to Richard's questions. Yes, we have seen a shift towards mixed use, but it's still, mixed use. Putting a bookshop in the lobby and a restaurant on the top of the building is not mixed use. There are so many things, and that is, for me, the future of the city. We need to bring all aspects of the city up into the vertical realm.
Thanks.
Yeah, I quite agree. But what tends to happen, and I'm just, let's say, putting across let's say I'm putting across the problem. The problem is that a lot of times the developer understands the value of that amenity, be it a park, a river, a seafront, and then the benefit of that amenity is essentially absorbed by the maximum number of people, units, office space, whatever else that you can put adjacent to that. And it's very rare, unfortunately, to have a developer that has the sort of the vision and perhaps the freedom to, let's say, build those amenity elements of the infrastructure into the building. And it seems to me that it's really only in environments where the city governance really puts quite a pressure on the individual developer, let's say in relation to the amount of area or units or saleable yield that they develop, that they must return these things to the city. And that to me seems like a fair balance, really. But it really does rely on a kind of overarching governmental incentive. It's rare that just spontaneously emerges from the generally more self-oriented approach that or let's say dynamics that are the major force behind most of the building projects that we're dealing with.
Actually, I go a stage further there, Ben, and what I didn't say is, to deliver that vision that I've just shown requires a complete rethought of how cities are conceived. Because if we leave it to the owner developers who are looking to make a financial return, it won't happen. And that's no disrespect to the owner developers. They're looking for a financial return. But here's the thing. That city that I've just shown with the infrastructure-rich vertical realm needs to be delivered through public-private partnership. Who is it that pays for the shops and the sidewalks and the parks and the sewage, everything at the minute, the infrastructure at the ground plane? It's the government. Well, we just put 9 million people paying 9 million more taxes there. So those layers of infrastructure need to be incorporated in the buildings, and the buildings themselves need to become public-private partnership. It's not down to the owner developer to pay for the park. It's down to the government. And we need this collective vision of sustainable vertical urbanism. And by the way, the reason that it's not happening, we probably don't want to go too far down this path, is because the lack of political will. The short-termism of re-election in 3-4 years. So the places where it has happened, and back to your slide, Nico, about Singapore, being one of the, voted one of the best cities. That's why it's happened in Singapore and places like that, because it's not the short-termism kind of, political structure. The reality is that Singapore has gone head and shoulders above any other city, in my view, in trying to deliver on all these things that we're talking about, sky bridges, urban habitat in the sky, green walls, all these things, because it's taken a view and delivered on a view that's 40, 50 years, long, not 3-4 years. But financially, what I've presented there, I think can stack up, but we need to rethink how cities are conceived.
Thanks, Antony and Benjamin and Javier. I'm coming back to you now, but Richard, I think you got a good answer to your question. There's more coming. Please keep doing so. And I think with the climate goals that we are now we have to meet as a society, then it's really only about partnership. It only can happen together. So really exciting to see how this vision is going to happen. But let's go to talk a little bit about the vision that Antony just showed with us, where you have cities which are interconnected with each other. Obviously, you need highly efficient ways of moving people. So we come to the mobility topic. We come to the favorite topic of Javier. So, and we all know the pressure to facilitate that movement, rather emissions free, and not any cars burning fossil fuels for sure. So looking at the view of the future of the tall buildings that we just saw from Antony, and maybe also reflecting on Ben, what you just said about what architects are designing and what is the pressure from the developers. Where is the mobility going? And what are some of the innovations we have been seeing? And also we can see at the World Expo. Yeah. I'm talking to Mr. Mobility here, obviously.
Yeah, no, thanks very much. And I think I love, obviously, I mean, on one side, the vision of let's say, breaking our idea that a building is just a vertical place, a vertical element that I think some of the architects call it a donut building, which where you have, if we see the way we are building buildings today, I mean, most of the core of the building is elevator shafts. And let's say, I mean, let's face it, I mean, elevator industry is an industry that haven't changed much in the last almost 160 years, because it was just a cabin and a counterweight moving up and down, okay? And on that, I think, let's say our company has developed a visionary solution. By the way, I mean, fits very much with Antony's vision, which is able to connect buildings on different dimensions. I mean, so just imagine that. I mean, the technology is called multi. We show it in the Dubai Expo, and the idea here is to connect people not just at the vertical level, but also at the horizontal level. This is a technology that probably started to think when first we tried to move more than one cabin in one shaft with what we call, let's say, a twin solution. So this enabled to reduce the space needed, I mean, for high-rise buildings, and probably give more freedom to use better the space, to reduce, I think you were mentioning sustainability, embodied carbon. So this is something that obviously give us already 15 years ago the opportunity to start to think differently, to increase the capacity, to reduce the sustainability. But from that technology, what we did was move to something completely different, which was a multi-technology, which is what we are showcasing in Expo. So just imagine that instead of having these cabins with one rope, now we just take out the rope and propel multiple cabins to move independently in one shaft. So we will give architects like Ben, let's say, the opportunity to design vertical buildings without limitation in height or in horizontal connection. We will give them multiple possibilities. That is also the reason why we call it multi, but this also gives the possibility to connect buildings to the cities, building to the public infrastructure. So part of the vision that Antony was showing, because we truly believe that buildings cannot become vertical cities, isolated silos. I mean, buildings need to speak to cities, okay? Need to connect to cities, and people need to live interconnected. And that's why some of these technologies, like multi, enable those visions. I do agree with Ben. I mean, definitely, I mean, I think the challenge is also how we can, let's say, bring to the same table the interest of developers of cities. I mean, maybe to challenge the question, I mean, who is owning those horizontal links on the sky? So who is going to own those spaces, those air, let's say, spaces, and what is the best use for those spaces? I mean, we clearly see mobility will become 3D, and when I'm saying 3D, it's not just a street level or underground, but also at the sky level with the sky bridges. And we have seen, I think CTBUH has, I mean, seen and also priced a lot of examples of buildings with horizontal links. We see that more and more. I think also in Dubai, there is also very interesting, let's say, developments on sky level. And I think that I would like to see that view happening, because we will be able to free up a space out of the street, which is where we see all these cities very, very congested.
Yeah, look, I think it makes me think about how. I mean, it's interesting if you take NASA, for example. When NASA is developing new kind of technologies or let's say strategies for reaching new heights, they'll actually look at the trajectory for other technologies developing and then try to match that trajectory with other trajectories, so that they're coming together at a future point at the same time when the various technologies have matured. And I think it's quite interesting to remember that in approximately 1 minute, there's enough energy landing on the surface of the planet to power all of this world's cities and all of humankind for a year. And that's just sunlight. I mean, you could think about geothermal, you can think about fission, and it's more or less a technological problem that I'm pretty confident in humankind that we can solve, that we're coming up to a period of time where energy may be in such abundant quantities that it is no longer something that constrains us as it has in the past. And that's not science fiction. That's the reality. That's the energy that is present. It's just how to convert that. And I think one of the things that's perhaps slightly challenging with the multi-system at the moment, it's quite energy intensive, because it is relying on the sort of vertical maglev type of system rather than the cables and the counterweights that you mentioned before. But I think it's a wonderful opportunity to be free of the traditional constraints and really think, well, what if we could connect, from the subway on a different plot directly to your apartment in a building, or what if we could get away with take cores completely out of towers and just use the surface of towers as the means of moving vertically or horizontally? What if we could all have, personal flying drones, and the streets of the city could be converted back into the parks and the amenities that Antony was talking about, and we have this whole multi-layered and super efficient transport network in the sky. So they are on one hand, you could say, on the cusp of science fiction, but they're also on the cusp of reality. And like my point earlier with the engineers of NASA needing to look at all forms of technological development, I'm sure within our own lifetimes we'll see these come into being, and they will have a radical impact on the forms of our buildings and the possibilities of our buildings.
That's we bring out NASA, Ben, science fiction, and indeed, if I look at some of the designs, I mean, they do remind me of Blade Runner, but in a nice way. It's kind of a positive version of Blade Runner, where movement of people is much more clean. Before we wrap up, because we are running out of broadcast time, because we have so many different aspects to cover, I want to talk a little bit about sustainability, and maybe you can also wrap up as we close this session, because I know there are people in the audience who are also thinking about, well, how do you make these cities sustainable? How do you reduce these emissions? What can we do to make especially high rises even more energy efficient? And maybe, Antony, if I start again with you, because you made a study about the efficiency of using high rises versus low rises, and how some people have a misconception that high rises are more energy incentive, which they kind of are, but then kind of not if you look from a city level. But before you go there, Antony, let me also ask the final question from my side to everybody, because we have also a young audience. We have young architects out there, wannabe architects who want to become Ben. They want to become Antony, and they're actually designing the cities of 2050. So what would be your advice to these young people who want to design cities which are clean, they're sustainable, and they are very livable? People want to work and live there. So a lot of questions in once, but Antony, let's start with you.
So the study you referred to, we did a study where we took 200 households living in high-rise buildings in Chicago and compared them with 200 households living in 7 miles outside the city in the suburb of Oak Park. And we evaluated everything. We evaluated their energy bills, their transport movements, the embodied energy of the home. We evaluated everything over a 2-year period. And I can tell you that the results were surprising, shocking in some cases. For example, I'll just tell you one. Car ownership in the high-rise buildings was higher than the suburb. And the reason was because we took these 3 buildings and didn't realize that they were all inhabited by extremely rich, retired people who had nothing to do all day except get in their car and drive back out to the suburbs to see their friends. So, so the study was skewed, but the positive finding was that really it's all about the infrastructure. It's all, the future of cities is about the collective benefits of urban density. It's not just about the building, and Ben said earlier about, it's not just about tall buildings are the way to achieve density. But it is about the collective benefits of urban density in 2 senses: preservation of land, using less land and less energy to create and operate the city. So basically, the suburban home required something like 714% of linear infrastructure to support it as to the person living downtown. And that was the key finding, 7-8 times more infrastructure in roads and rail and, water and electricity and all that. And that is absolutely massive. To go to your question about, architects of the future, and really we need a multi-pronged approach. There's no one solution to all this. I mean, at the very big level, first thing we need to do is move to a carbon economy. Absolutely no-brainer. Nothing will change till we move to a carbon economy and actually factor in carbon. So at the very big political, social, economic levels, things need to happen. And then at the design level, we need to build out a mass timber. It's a total game changer. It's the only material that is a game changer. We need to introduce green walls. We need to introduce social space, all these things. So it's not a one-liner. But what I would say to the architects, the future Bens that are perhaps tuning in looking at this is, it is an exciting future. We will get there. I mean, what Ben just said there, in 1 minute we get enough energy falling on this planet to power a year. It's about how do we translate it? How do we take it? And how do we store it? We're not waiting for new technologies really to save us. The technologies and the ability to solve climate problems, sustainability problems are with us. We just need the collective social and political will to do it.
And before we go to future Ben, let's go to future Javier. Javier, what are your advice to the young architects out there who want to build sustainability into the cities going forward?
I think I absolutely agree with Antony on the approach, and maybe let me put a very simple approach that many cities are taking as of today, and we see that all across Europe, but we should also start to see that in Asia Pacific. I mean, are become, let's say, older, aging of population. So there is, let's say, 2 key elements. One of them is the impact of road transportation. The other one is definitely aging of population. There is a study says that maybe between 30 to 80% of the CO2 emissions can be avoided by pedestrianization of cities. So speaking about that, let's say collective, you call it a collective benefit. We have seen in different cities, worldwide, Spain being one of them, but also Hong Kong, where they have, let's say, taking a public and private partnership to start to pedestrianize cities. And I think that has a very, very interesting benefit. On one side, you eliminate cars out of that area. You start to build, let's say, what I think most of the architects call that 15-minute city, which is a city where you can make your life, go to commerce. And that is a very interesting way. We have seen, I mean, Hong Kong is a very good example with the sky bridges. I mean, historical buildings in Spain also are doing that, taking out the cars of those old zones, and in some cases that is even the only mobility solution for that people in the aging population. So advice, to keep it short, I think obviously speaking about mobility for those future designs, I mean, we need to make sure that mobility shall be sustainable, shall be fully accessible to all, and shall also be inclusive. And the view of mobility needs to be, we will be moving people, but also goods and also data. I think those are the probably three dimensions we need to take into account when looking into mobility in the three dimensions: sky, street, and underground level.
Yeah, thanks, Javier. Looking forward to the innovation still coming, I think, to facilitate all these things. Future Ben, what are you saying to the younger Bens out there?
Well, look, I think that at the root of every architect's passion is this notion that you can make the world a better place and that you can make a tangible difference using your brain, but translating your brain and your ideas into physical form that is actually manifest perhaps long after you're gone as an individual, but that can kind of echo through society in the way that the buildings are used. And I suppose, you know, the number one most responsible and most sustainable thing that you can do as an architect is to make sure that whatever you're building is going to last for as long as it possibly can. And so that it remains, and in order to do that, it must remain relevant, it must be flexible, it must be valued by society. Maybe even it's just so aesthetically stunning piece of work that it never gets knocked down and it just becomes preserved and a kind of a symbol of aesthetic beauty. There's many ways to go about it, but I think, you know, this word sustainable architecture, you know, really needs to be unpacked. It's not just the, let's say, the building physics aspect of sustainability, but it's in a way even more simple than that. It's what do you need to do to make the building come off the page, off the drawings, and translate into reality, and become realized. But what do you do to make sure that isn't just building? There's plenty of building going on in the world, but there's less architecture. Architecture is where there's some kind of germ of an idea, some kind of investigation, some kind of higher level aspiration that is expressed through the building and explored through the building. And I think if I would give any advice to young architects, or any architect, I suppose, and certainly advice I try to give myself, is that every single project that you do should have that special moment of contribution, I suppose, to trying to make the world a better place and expressing that through the form of architecture.
Wow. Thank you, Ben. I think these were very wise words. Making the world a better place, also making the world a brighter place, what we do at Covestro. We are out of our broadcast time, so thank you so much, Antony. Thank you so much, Ben. Thank you, Javier, for taking the time out of your, I know, busy schedules to discuss these, I think, very exciting topics that really affect us all going forward. And I think you put us a lot of positive inspiration, how the future may be the positive kind of Blade Runner with cities which are interconnected, vertical and horizontal. The technology is there and the data is being put to good use. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you also for audience for giving your commentary to us, and look forward to seeing you again soon. And we have to redo this because there are so many aspects of future cities we still have to discuss going forward. Thank you very much for joining.
Great. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
So we will return to the World Expo topics quite soon on the topic of energy, really green energy. So stay tuned on our channel as we announce the updates. Until then, stay safe, stay healthy, and bye-bye.